all at crossroads. Today, however, he will focus and present his findings from over a decade of research on the Indiana's Choice Scholarship Program. His presentation will provide valuable insights into the complexities of school choice programs, exploring why schools opt in, how student outcomes are affected, and what lessons can be applied to the broader landscape of educational reform. After Dr. Berends' presentation, you will have a chance to ask him questions in a Q&A session. And our guests online, we will be monitoring the chat, and you may place them in the chat, and we will ask them publicly but anonymously. Before we begin, a few little housekeeping items. Would you kindly locate your devices and place them in the silent mode so that they may notify you of any messages, but in a very private and silent manner. This way, we can each fully appreciate the presentation. And now something that we have been planning for and waiting for a long, long time. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. Mark Berends. Mark, welcome to Texas A&M University.
Thank you so much. It's very, very, very gracious. It's great to be here. Well, thank you, Dean DeMiranda. It's just an absolute thrill to be here. I haven't done this for a while for various reasons, and it's great to be on this campus. And last night at dinner, Jeff Gagne was gracious enough to talk about some of the traditions and things that go on in the culture of Texas A&M, and I really appreciate that. I'm from Notre Dame, right? And Notre Dame is full of tradition. The joke at Notre Dame is if something happens twice, it's tradition, and we go forward with that. And it was just great to hear some of that. So to begin, I just want to say, oh, it's not going. There we go. I want to say howdy. It's a thrill to be here. So before I get going, want to just acknowledge some of the people. Can I walk around on Zoom? Is that okay? I just want to thank some of the people that have supported this work. I've been doing this work on school choice for a long, long time, but particularly in Indiana since the program started. And so we've done a lot of research that I want to share with you today, just to kind of get us to think about, as these school choice policies and parental choice policies expand, just kind of think about some things that we need to be aware of as they're implemented, and some of the implications, not only for the students in private schools, but students across the nation. And so thankful for the Department of Education, particularly the Indiana Department of Education, that has provided access. They came to Notre Dame when the program first started. Tony Bennett was a state superintendent and wanted an objective look, as objective as possible, to look at the voucher program, and I truly appreciate that. It was a Republican administration at the time in a very red state. That may sound familiar, I'm not sure, but wanted to kind of have some rigorous research along the way to look at that, so we're thankful to that. Notre Dame has been very supportive of this work. As the U.S. Department of Education, once we knew something called the Institute for Educational Sciences when it existed, very appreciative of their funding, and also the Spencer Foundation. All of this is not to blame them, this is all on me and colleagues, and we take responsibility for any errors or misstatements. This has involved a big research team of faculty at Notre Dame. My dear colleague Joe Waddington was here last fall. I'm reminding you of some of what he said, but kind of expanding that to the other work that we have done. It's involved a lot of undergraduates and graduate students, as well as external partners in various places. And again, the Indiana Department of Education has been a big partner in all of this as well, and thankful for their support. So I want to cover a lot today. Bear with me as I go through this. And just so you know, I'm happy to answer questions as we go. I'm used to being interrupted. I'll answer your questions as best I can, and then hopefully I'll talk for, I don't know, hopefully not talk, I'll talk in a way that we have plenty of time at the end for questions. That's my goal. So I really just want to describe this policy and how it's changed over time, because there's been some significant changes for increasing the participation. And I want to go back to when it first began, back in the fall of 2011 and in 2012. What were those early experiences of implementation like? And why did schools choose to participate or not? And we have some data that we can talk about that in early participation. I want to talk about the impacts on achievement. This is really about early on in the program, where it was means tested for kids in low and modest income families that were using a scholarship or a voucher to move from a public school to a private school. And all the students in the state of Indiana, public and private, take the same state tests, so that allows us to do some interesting things statistically. And so I'll talk about that. I'll talk about, that kind of moves us into some of the qualitative work that we've done in terms of the early implementation experiences that kind of give us some hypotheses perhaps about some of the quantitative findings that we had. A big issue in school choice is whether we're talking about charter schools or schools that have voucher students. Are they taking the best students? Are they cream skimming the best students from public schools? And then likewise, are they pushing out their more expensive students to educate, whether that's due to poverty or some status like English language learner, kids with disabilities or things like that. So we'll look at that. And then we have some data that we can start to get inside schools. I'll talk briefly about that, of what schools are actually doing and what some of the school climate issues are in some of these schools. And then I'll end with what's the relationship between having a voucher through high school and educational attainment. Hopefully I'll cover that all. I may have to give some of it short shrift, but that's my goal. So it's ambitious, but here we go. So I just want to talk about, we have various data sources. So one is the Indiana Department of Education, where we have longitudinal records on students, teachers, and schools. This goes all the way back to 2009 up to the present. And we have some issues, most of our analyses that I'll show today are from 2009 for like 5, 6, 7, 8 years out. So that covers before the pandemic, before some of where they stopped testing. There's been major change in the test, so we're not dealing with some of that in our analyses. We also early on, she was a graduate student, Megan Austin at the time, did a state survey of schools to survey why did they participate or why didn't they participate, and heard from a lot of schools, so we'll touch on that. Then we had a state representative sample of about 570 schools where we gathered school climate information, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I really was grateful that we could do interviews. Early on in the implementation, we did about 100 interviews. We were in about a dozen, 10 schools, a dozen, depending on how we think about it, where we interviewed principals, we interviewed teachers, and then we interviewed parents and their kids, some of whom received a voucher and some of whom did not, just to get at things like what were those experiences like in making these transitions for the families who took up a voucher, as well as the schools that were receiving voucher kids. And then we repeated that. We went back to the same 10 schools. All the participants changed over that time period, but kind of went back to get at their later implementation practice as well. So I'll touch on that during this talk. This isn't a methods, stats heavy talk. It's more of giving you an overlay of what we've been finding, but I will touch on some of the data sources as we go. So some background about the Indiana Choice Program. So in Indiana, they meet early on in the year. In 2011, they passed the Indiana Choice Scholarship Bill. They started implementing it that fall. There was a good number of schools that implemented that fall. I can speak for the Catholic sector. All the bishops in Indiana were totally on board with that. And they did everything they could to make it easy for families to apply for a scholarship to attend a private school. The program beginning was means tested, that it was for low and modest income families. And a big part of that was that a student who was eligible for a voucher had to be in a public school for 2 semesters before making that transition to a private school. That changed over time, and I'll talk about some of these expansions of opening up pathways, as well as raising the income eligibility, which has increased a lot over time. And then because of the great deal of student and school participation, it makes these one of the largest statewide voucher programs in the country. That's about to change, I think, in Texas and in other places, but it's one of the biggest. And so we have this luxury of that. The public and private schools in Indiana, we basically have the same data. That's a little bit of an overstatement, because if we're interested in things like student suspensions, private schools aren't great at providing reliable information, but test scores, demographics, other school characteristics, it's an apples to apples comparison, if you will. So in terms of the policy context, it started in 2011, 2012. It required a whole school year in a public school. There was another pathway for students to enter in, but this was a big shock to the system, right? So you had a lot of students making these transfers from a public school to a private school. There were 2 voucher levels, one of what they call a 90% tuition. This is based on, the voucher was based on giving 90% of the state per pupil expenditure to families if they were at the poverty level or below. There was also a half voucher, a 50% voucher that you could be making, what is it, $75,000 for a family of 4 and qualify for a half voucher. So this was the big shock to the system. This is where most of the kids were making the move, and it started out with low numbers, and you can see how it's increased over time. 2013, there was some changes to open up pathways. So they expanded the eligibility requirements. They no longer required that you attended a public school in the past. So you can imagine why, right? So what's your name? Either one. Davi. So Davi, you're a family that has made sacrifices, working a couple jobs to be able to send your children to a private school. I'm at the same income level. I didn't make those sacrifices. All of a sudden, I've become eligible for a voucher, and you don't. I would imagine that you were pretty ticked off at me because of that, right? And that happened across the state. So there's a lot of pushback on this. And so they opened up the pathway for that. You could also, if you were a kindergartner, you qualified, if you had siblings, or if you were in, this was back when Indiana was giving grades to schools and districts. If you were in a failing district, you could apply for a voucher as well. They continued the levels in terms of the full voucher and the half voucher. They did open up another pathway that was kind of the 70% of the per pupil's state expenditure. That and some other pathways really didn't change the participation much. But you can see kind of the bump with the opening of you didn't have to attend a public school in terms of the second phase of the voucher program. Phase 3 happened in 21-22. Same eligibility pathways, but they expanded the income eligibility. So all of a sudden became 300% of the poverty line. And so that you could be making about $150,000 in a family of 4 and qualify for a voucher. And they eliminated the voucher level. So no longer was there this 90% half voucher. It was everybody got the full amount of what was possible. There was further expansion in 2020-23 where the income level went up to 400% of the poverty line. And in 2024, you could be making $230,000 in a family of 4 and qualify for a full voucher. So it's almost become like a universal voucher program. Not quite, but it's getting there. So let's go back to initially about decisions that schools made to either participate in the voucher program or not. So we did a survey of all the schools with a pretty good response rate, about 65, 70%. And we asked things like, we asked schools about why they participated. So you can see that in private school, these are private schools responding. A lot of them were expanding because of their mission. That blue tallest bar is that they're just citing it as a reason. The red or middle bar here is it's cited as one of the top 3 reasons for participating. And then this last bar is that it's the single most important reason for participating. So you can see across this, whether it's the mission, helping voucher eligible families or needy children, or bringing back further families. I mean, the bottom line here is that private schools were participating because of their mission and service and helping families. But that wasn't the only reason they participated. They participated for some financial reasons as well. This was fill open seats in our classes and strengthening a financial mission and making sure eligible families were interested. And what's interesting here is in the last one, I thought this would be, I come from the Catholic sector. Catholic schools are closing every day. And so I thought these reasons might be more important at the time. But prevent school from closing, nobody actually chose that as the most important reason. So, but there are various reasons why schools participated. There's also reasons why schools didn't participate. And a lot of that had to do with autonomy and freedom from government intervention, religious freedom, and some of the schools were concerned about academic standards and things like that. And so this sort of regulatory burden, to kind of summarize that, was a big reason why schools chose to not participate in the program. So that's why they participated. Let's talk about who participates over time. Now, again, my colleague Joe Waddington was here last fall, and he went through this in great detail. So I'm just going to show you a chart to kind of remind you of what we've been finding about changes. As the policy changes over time, how has the participation changed over time in terms of schools and the characteristics of students? So in terms of the schools, from early on, nearly all of the Catholic schools participated in the voucher program. As I said, the bishops were on board, and they were very engaged in getting families to use the voucher program. There was a significant increase in private schools, which has increased from, was it 62 or 82 in 2012 to most recently 190. And some of this has to do with, they mentioned the regulatory burden, and as some of these pathways opened up, you'll see in a minute why this makes sense, why some of these religious private schools decided to participate. There were changes in demographics over time with these policy changes. There was a significant increase in the percentage of white students participating in the voucher program. It's now at like 64%. Roughly 66% in the state are white students, so it's about comparable to the state. But there was a significant decrease in the percentage of black students. Early on, like a quarter of the students participating in the program were black. And that's decreased most recently to about 9%, which is, they're underrepresented compared to the state as a whole. In terms of the Latino population, that's been pretty consistent. It's been about 17% of the students receiving vouchers are Latino or Hispanic. And that's an overrepresentation compared to the percentage of Latino students in the state of Indiana. And then there's been a big increase in the percentage of higher income families that are participating in this, and a decrease in the percentage of students in poverty. And you see, just taking free and reduced price lunch, went from 87% in 2012 down to 57% in 2024. So that's a significant increase. So overall, you can see this program change that started out being means tested, and a lot of students who are black and brown and other low-income families were taking advantage of this. And over time, you can see this getting whiter and wealthier over time. And now that it's basically universal, a lot of families are there and basically find now that early on it was flipped, where most of the kids they had to early on, but then even as the pathways opened, a lot of the kids were in traditional public schools before they made the transition, where now only about a third of students on scholarships have had an experience prior in a traditional public school. So we can talk about implications of that in the Q&A. So what are the early impacts on achievement? We look at achievement, and this is early on when the program that was really means tested, kids were qualifying for free and reduced lunch. We're looking at those kids and look at them as they transfer to a private school. And we compare them to the comparable kids that stayed in the public school. So we have these longitudinal records from the Indiana Department of Education. These go over several years from 2009-10 to 2014-15. We have math and English. These are standardized by grade and year. And they're all taking the same test, so it's apples to apples comparison. We have other student characteristics there, ELL, English language learners, and special education or kids on disabilities is part of that. We link this to Common Core of data and the public school survey for other characteristics of the school. And we're really looking at these kids who are eligible for and on free and reduced price lunch. Looking at those kids, they make this transfer into a private school. And we match on this, we match on race, sex, year, grade, and call these cell fixed effects. And we also adjust in our regression models for pre-treatment trends. So the way to think about this is we're looking at pre-treatment, we're looking at kids with third and fourth grade test scores. They make the switch, and we can track them for basically 4 years in grades 5 through 8. And so that, in terms of what we find, in English language arts or reading, we find basically no effect. And you can see, this is no effect, and these are the error bars where it's basically overlapping, so there's not really an effect. And even in this one, that's relatively small, of like 0.04 or something like that. So basically, we say that there really wasn't an impact on reading achievement for these kids that switched. They're doing no differently than their matched peers in public schools. In math, however, we find a significant decrease, particularly in year 1. Right away, there's a decrease in their math achievement by the level of like 0.15 standard deviations. It goes down to like minus 0.16, 0.17 in there. Basically, to think about this is it's a significant effect. It's like 5 percentile point drop in their math achievement, maybe 5 to 6, depending on the year. But what's concerning here is that it drops and then it stays there over 4 years, which is concerning. So what are the takeaways on this? The math loss, is that really a disruption of kids moving from a public to a private school? And I'll talk more about that in a minute, about some ways we might think about that. So voucher students are moving, they're more behind in private schools than their public school peers. So way to think about this, these kids on vouchers at baseline are about a quarter of a standard deviation lower than the state average on their math achievement and reading achievement. They're moving to schools, private schools, that are on average 0.1, 0.2 standard deviations above the state mean. So that's kind of a big jump for some of these students. And so that's a big adjustment to make. And these findings, this study came out right when Louisiana came out with their statewide voucher program. David Figlio was looking at this in Ohio. They found even more negative effects, particularly in mathematics, stronger negative effects in mathematics than we did. And we can talk about some reasons for that. But what's interesting, these are different policies, different researchers, and all at the same time is that we're finding these statewide voucher programs at scale were having negative effects on kids across the board and across states. So we'll get into this in a minute, but voucher students are challenged. They're challenged by academic integration, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And there's difference in curriculum and expectations. So let's talk about that in terms of the early implementation experiences. And we're going to we looked at social, academic, and religious integration, and kind of talk about the summary, and then I'll get into more of the specifics. So what we did is we did interviews early on of like 100 different individuals, and most of this comes from principals and teachers. And basically, we did all these interviews. We coded them up. At the time, we used Atlas TI, and we found that generally the voucher students were pretty well integrated, but there were some challenges, right? So of all the reports through the interviews and when we coded them, about 45% of the voucher students talked about some of the, these challenges of meeting expectations, and that they did, and that's pretty good. But over half were reporting kind of mixed. So there was a challenge there, and so they were really concerned about meeting the academic expectations, but also a big part was this transition of these private schools. They really had no concept of homework in their previous public school settings. So that was a big thing in particularly some of these Catholic schools that are homework, which may be good or a bad thing, I don't know, but they didn't really have an issue of doing work outside of class. In social integration, some reports of teachers were talking about behavioral expectations, that kids were acting up in class, and that was a problem. They had a sense that from their perspective, they were thinking that they were making appropriate adaptations to these kids. Because they, again, going back, they really wanted, a lot of these private schools wanted these kids here because it was part of their mission, right? And so we can't forget that. And they also found that kids were making friends and that they were participating in extracurricular activities. They got involved in religious activities. We don't really know from these interviews about the substance of that, but they would attend some of these religious activities, whether it's in the school or outside the school. And then one of the things that we found in the interviews, we did interviews at different levels, and we found that the challenges were greater if kids were making these transitions later on in their schooling career. Just to give an example of homework, we asked teachers, how would you say that voucher students or newer students in general have adjusted to the expectations of homework? So you might find this question a little bit curious, but let me explain something to you. So early on in the program, nobody was supposed to know who the voucher kids were. Only the principal and the school knew who the voucher program, which kids were receiving vouchers. But there's a lot of new kids, and you had a lot of kids who were black and brown. So people made assumptions. And we couldn't kind of get to the bottom of that in our interviews, but this is based on their perceptions. So that's why we talked about newer students as well. So, what we found in talking to principals, it's like they knew, and some of the principals would say, yeah, they have this perception, but those kids aren't even on the voucher program. Right? So there was that thing going on. So just keep that in your mind too. But part of the question was how they adapted the expectations of homework. Teacher says poorly. So a little pro, what do you mean by poorly? Yes, I think that's one of the biggest struggles that our newer students have is what's expected outside of the building. Doing the homework and getting the homework turned in has been probably the major challenge for newer students. So this came up again and again in our interviews, and so homework was an issue. Expectations was also an issue. The expectations of the new school based in comparison of the schools that they came from. As a principal said, I don't think if you walked into a classroom right now, you would be able to tell one from the other. The thing that might single a choice scholarship student out, maybe at the beginning, is they just don't understand their level of expectation. But after they've been here a while, they understand. And when I say a while, I'm saying a month, and there's a little chuckle there. This is kind of your heavy-handed Catholic school principal, like, you're gonna get on board with our expectations. And then they understand very quickly. And it's not to be pejorative to this principal. I mean, part of this is these high expectations. They really wanted to help these kids and adjust for that, and that's kind of where that quote is coming from. Social integration, as one teacher said, I think the biggest challenge is figuring out how to integrate these new students into the classroom in a positive way and not to make it negative. I'm not a punitive person that wants to, I'm not a person that wants to make things punitive, especially when they're having troubles. But I think when you come from what she said was a very free environment into and you come to a very structured environment, it's very difficult, and that's very challenging. And so that's part of the social integration that's occurring. So how did they address these challenges? They did this in different ways. So they did boot camps and intensive tutorials, particularly in mathematics. I mean, this is this is at a time where they knew what their kids' math achievement were, and we hadn't even published our study yet. But they were aware of this, and they targeted these tutorials to kind of catch these kids up in mathematics. They'd have after-school programs. They'd have lower level or remedial courses. I'm not sure what that means. I've had a long history early in my career looking at ability group and tracking, and that can be used in positive ways or negative ways in terms of isolation in classrooms. But they may have been using these remedial courses to really catch kids up. It could be both of those things, and our data can't disentangle those two. They also did a lot of parent involvement. There's a lot of communication from teachers to families, parent education nights. They involved parents in larger community and tutoring programs to help these kids. So these are just some of the ways the schools adapted. Again, this is based on interviews in 10 schools, so I don't want to overgeneralize, but this is some of the findings that are coming out to help us kind of make sense of some of the negative findings that we found, particularly in mathematics. So let's turn now to whether voucher schools cream skim or push out students. And so this is a big issue, right? Because it has to do with equity and educational opportunities, right? If private schools are only taking the best students, or they're pushing out kind of difficult to educate students, I mean, that is an issue of equity in terms of this is public money going to private schools, and they have a responsibility to teach all students. And so that has to be in our minds. Also, if families are not making decisions on their own, but the school is making a decision for them, that has implications potentially for their mobility. Now, we're not really able to disentangle whether it's a family decision or a school decision, but we're able to look at kind of the rates at which high-performing students leave a public school, and we compare them to the similar high-performing students that leave a public school and go somewhere else, not a private school, but somewhere else. And so that's how we look at cream skimming. High-performing, we define in different ways, whether the students just above the school average, whether the students at the 70th percentile on the state test, or the 90th percentile on the state test. And if there is cream skimming and pushing out, traditional public schools are kind of left with students that are really difficult to educate and really becomes more challenging for them. And there also affects that the peers are left there. You think about positive peer effects. That's one of the arguments of why we want low and modest income families in private schools, because maybe there's positive peer effects, but if they end up going back to a public school, that there may be worse peer effects there. Also, there's not a lot of literature on vouchers being able to look at both of these issues at the same time. And so we have the luxury with the data we have to do this. This is non-causal. This is more descriptive in terms of we're just looking at rates of students that change school compared to comparable students. And so that's kind of where we're at. What do we find? Well, we don't find any evidence with the claim that private schools are cream skimming the best students. The best students in terms of whether they're high performing. In the public schools, we have disciplinary data like suspensions, and so it's not that they're taking less disruptive students. They're not taking less costly students to educate, because you can imagine that English language learners and students with disabilities are more costly to educate, and it's not like private schools were avoiding those students. They would take, so there was none of this cream skimming, taking the best students going on. However, when we get to push out, we do have some findings that are consistent with the claim that the lowest performing students are pushed out. They lose, low performing voucher students exit private schools at modestly higher rates than their high performing private school peers. It's not huge, but it's like 3 to 9 percentiles. The rate is greater for them. And then lower performing public school students statewide, that's even less, 1 to 3 percentile points. Also, in terms of special ed and English language learners, it's much more mixed. Special ed voucher students are slightly more likely to exit private schools. However, English language learners are slightly more likely to stay in private schools. We don't have reasons for why that is, but that's what's going on. So there is some push out. It's not a huge amount, but there is some. And I just want to add more. This is kind of terms used from the literature. And just some of our interviews can kind of shed some light potentially on this push-out issue. So in some ways, push-out is kind of a, if you will, malicious kind of term. We don't want to educate them and they. We don't want to educate them. And clearly there was some comments in some of the interviews, somewhat uncomfortable to kind of be on the receiving end of that some of that was going on. So that's an unfortunate part of some of this push-out. There is another part of push-out that is more positive. So, we've talked to principals where I'm a principal in a Catholic school. Your child has some sort of disability. I'm just going to be honest, my school doesn't have the capacity or resources to address your child's needs. There's another Catholic school down the street that might be, or there's a public school that would just be fabulous for this kind. There was some of that coming out in the interviews as well. So I don't want to kind of paint this push out as that it's all malicious. Unfortunately, some of it is. But some of it's not. And again, this is based on interviews in 10 different schools, so take that for what it's worth. So what's going on inside schools? I'll kind of go through this. I want to kind of get to the end so there's plenty of time for questions, but what's going on inside schools? So, basically, we were interested in what makes schools effective in Indiana. We don't care if you're a public school, private school, Catholic school, charter school. We just want to kind of look at school effectiveness and really looking at the organizational instructional conditions. And this is really this is the framework that we used. If you're interested in this in a much more kind of theoretical explanation, I recommend Tony Brike's work with colleagues. It's a 2010 book about improving schools, and it's much more elaborated framework. So it's based on Tony Brike's work, how to work with the Consortium for School Research in Chicago, as well as previous studies that I've done and others have done. And we were trying to, the framework here is really around supporting ambitious instruction. And ambitious instruction depends on the school context. It has really effective leaders, both on the principal side and teacher side, collaborative teachers really working together. We can think about professional learning communities and other ways that teachers are really collaborating together for the good of the student and good of ambitious instruction. We have a supportive environment where it's safe and orderly, and it's a good school climate around that, as well as involve families, both in the school where that's appropriate, but also at home. And so all of that, it supports ambitious instruction, leads to school improvement, and hopefully positive outcomes. We had tons of measures around this where we created scales we used it from previous research where they had good measurement properties, like alpha reliabilities, if you will, but we also kind of went down the path to replicate the alpha reliabilities, did confirmatory factor analysis to kind of create more parsimonious scales along this. So that's kind of, in what I show, is kind of the background work for what we did. We collected a sample of state representative schools and did teacher and principal surveys. This was based on a Spencer grant where 95% of the funding went to the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, and it was well worth that. The interviews, or the surveys didn't take that long. We did that in the spring of 2017. You see the numbers of, about 570 schools and 5,300 teachers, and you see the number and breakdown. Unfortunately, at the time, there weren't a lot of charter schools, so we're a little thin on that. We have plenty of representative public schools and private schools as well. This is why it was so expensive. We had fabulous response rates. I'm usually, online surveys like this, I'm pretty happy with 70% or above. I'm going to survey now in this new environment that I don't think we're going to get near that because people are I'm not touching any sort of help with data collection, but we had really good response rates of principals and teachers. So what did we find? So the scale here is basically a Likert scale of, strongly disagree to strongly agree. We asked about expectations for instruction, academic press measure, time on task, and how the school used data. We see, and this first bar is the traditional public, and then Catholic, and then other private, which is all religious in our sample. And we see here that Other religious schools have lower expectations, and that's significantly lower than both Catholic schools and traditional public schools. That's what this is about. Whereas academic press, the private schools had higher levels of academic press reported by teachers, similar in time and task, and the private schools were less likely to use data. However, when we turn to there's much more higher levels of trust and collaborative responsibility in religious and private and Catholic schools. In terms of respect and trust, we had measures about the trust between teachers and principals, between teachers and parents, and then this is the collective responsibility of kind of going back to professional learning communities and really being involved that, as a group of teachers and administrators who really care about these kids, not only in the classroom, but beyond the classroom. So there's higher levels of that. Outside of that, and these are just simple descriptives, outside of that, in the analyses we've done, there are very few differences in these school effectiveness indicators across these sectors. And what's going on there is that there's much more variability in these school effective indicators within traditional public schools in our sample, within private schools, and within Catholic schools. And so we're in the process of trying to tease that out in ways that we can communicate wider. So that's just important to keep in mind that, we thought there would be great differences, and there really is not. And that's sort of similar to what we find in terms of achievement impacts and school choice right now, is really understanding the variation and effects in these different sectors and the heterogeneity of these effects as we move on. Okay, so lastly, I want to talk about is voucher school attendance associated with educational attainment? This is a paper in progress. I can talk about some of the frustrations we've had about getting this published, but I'll save that for the Q&A if you're interested. But basically, in terms of our preliminary findings, it's non-causal, it's descriptive. Some of our achievement work, we're modeling this after other quasi-experimental studies that were safer, talking about the estimates on achievement as kind of more causal. This is really descriptive. And the main reason is that we're using the same kind of modeling that we do in our achievement analyses that control for prior achievement. The problem with looking at educational attainment is you can't control on pretreatment, right? You can only control on prior achievement, say when the kids were in 7th and 8th grade. And that, we do the control group and the self-fixed effects, but that's presented a problem. Part of it is it's just some reviewers, I'll call them economists, if you will, are just been really critical of this. And I get that. It's different than the achievement analyses. And I think and we were trying to make it more causal in previous drafts. And now we're kind of really backing off that and just saying, okay, let's look at this descriptively and correlationally. And so that's where we're at. Only 64% of the participants in our analytical sample use a voucher for all 4 years of high school. The other 36% are leaving at some point. So for students that attended all 4 years, kind of high dosage, if you will, they had a 16 percentage point increase in going to college. Not only that was any college. 20% increase in attending a 4-year college. So that's a pretty significant, relationship, if you will. Students who discontinued receiving a voucher at some point during their high school career and went back to a public school, we didn't find any differences in terms of high school graduation. They were somewhat more likely to actually, they were 5 percentage points less likely to drop out of school. So we don't know what's going on there. Something about that experience in the private school. When they went back to the public school, they were less likely to drop out. And so that's the findings on educational attainment. In terms of summarizing all of this up, in terms of kind of thinking about participation, really good participation of the schools because of their mission to serve. It was somewhat about their finances and putting students in seats. Non-participation was really about, they wanted autonomy. They wanted less regulation. They were worried about religious freedom, and there was somewhat concern about lowering of academic standards. There were challenges of academic and social integration. Talked about homework and expectations, but schools tried to pivot and address these issues. And with policies over change, you see kind of, again, increase in the percentage of white students, decrease in the percentage of blacks, pretty consistent on black students, higher income, decrease in lower income. And again, only a third have some experience in this. And so that has implications for we think about the cost of these programs and what is actually saved when voucher programs are put in place. In terms of achievement, attainment, push out, and context, negative effects in math, no effects in English language arts. If you're fortunate enough to make it all the way through high school on a voucher, you're more likely to have some sort of college enrollment, particularly a four-year college. There's no cream skimming, but there is some push out. School context, they have higher academic press, trust, collective responsibility than traditional public schools, less use of student data. And again, most of these effective school pick from that big framework, and there's tons of measures within that. A lot of those didn't differ between sectors. There was more variation within. So kind of let's pivot a little bit towards Texas. I do this with fear and trepidation a little bit because I think this is a little fluid here. But this is, I have a student actually who works for the American Federation for Children. He should be working on his dissertation, but his life is very full because the American Federation for Children is very involved in advocating school choice policy. But just even in 22 to 24, 24 states passed legislation to expand school choice. We have 32 states where families are, 12 states where all families are eligible, and that's expanding in terms of these universal, not only voucher programs, which Indiana is moving for, but they have education savings account, which is a modification of the voucher programs, which I know Texas is thinking about. What I know about Texas at this moment, this is the first private school choice program in the state. This state has a ton of charter schools, but in terms of private school choice, I think this could be a huge challenge just because the infrastructure is not in place. I mean, go back to the kind of changes in policy in Indiana. It started pretty small, and now it's grown, and now that it's kind of almost universal, I mean, it's getting up to 70,000, maybe 100,000 students. And that's what the aim, so there's a Senate bill that passed, it was taken up by the House, it's now in reconciliation. My understanding is that this could be like $1 billion appropriation, and this is big, right, for 100,000 students. I mean, that's bigger than Indiana's program just out of the gate. And so that's an issue. There is a real focus, from what I understand, on low and modest income. I know there's some debates about that between the Senate version and the House version. And then special education or kids with disabilities is also a priority. There's also, I understand that there's money given to public schools in this to kind of offset the loss, which is interesting. At least public schools are not being forgotten in this kind of big bill like this. And my understanding is this is like $10,000 for families. That's a lot of money. And it could go up to like $30,000 for students with disabilities. If one is for this, it's good that kids with disabilities get even more for the needs that they have. There's also, I think, in the current version, about $1,000 for homeschoolers, and it's in reconciliation. Welcome to Texas, Mark Berends. I mean, this is really interesting, and part of this is, I think, is too down far in the path, but I think as states think about this, I have some hopes for Texas, and maybe those will be by the wayside as we go through this, but also for other states, because this is continuing across the nation to expand these programs for universal. And one of the things I think is really important based on our findings is that schools and families need time to prepare, because it's families that have to make the adjustment with their children if they choose to use ESAs or vouchers for a private school. But the schools also need time to adjust in terms of potentially some new students that are coming in that they haven't taught before. I think, this is pie in the sky, and I'm a researcher, but we really need to understand the impact. I mean, we have the luxury in Indiana that we can do some pretty rigorous studies with quasi-experimental methods But in other states, like Louisiana, they had a randomized process, and you could kind of think about starting this slowly with small numbers of kids that are kind of randomly assigned ESAs or vouchers and kind of gather data over time to kind of understand the impact of this. And this also relates to accountability. I'm not one, I've had a great career looking at test scores. I'm try to be the first to say that test scores are not the end all and be all. They are a rough proxy of what students learn, but there's so many other things that I think we need to start thinking cleverly and aggressively about gathering some of these other indicators about students' development, through K through 12 education and beyond, about kinds of things, whether that's engagement or innovation persistent, all of that in terms of gathering data around that. And that can be used in accountability for, what the state thinks of these, what different states thinks of these programs. Got to think about school quality. Like I said, in Indiana, the majority of private schools participated. That's very different. I talked about the negative findings in Louisiana, where some of the high quality private schools were not participating in the voucher program, and that may have had implications for the strong negative findings there. But we got to kind of think about school quality and kind of thinking about that in broad terms. Teacher training, there were big adjustments based on the interviews we did that teachers had in their classroom as their classrooms became more diverse. And you know how to do this here at Texas A&M. We need more of that as some of these programs unfold. And we got to think about, I know this stuff is going by the wayside in terms of DEI and woke, and I want to put that aside for a second. I'm not sure what that means, quite frankly. But I think we do need to think about equity in this in terms of consider how the program and how it's designed are going to have an impact on kids of different characteristics, whether that's students who are Black and brown, students who are low income, and other vulnerable groups. Whether it's English language learners or kids with disabilities. And we need to kind of think about that as these programs unfold. The unfortunate part is I'm not sure that a lot of these new programs in different states aren't gathering any information to kind of address any of this. But I just want to put this up here because I think we need to speak into, I want to speak into this, and my colleagues, on this research team want to speak into this because, we need to think about this going forward. There's some lessons to learn from Indiana. They may apply, they may not, but hopefully it's thought-provoking to think about implementing some of these new programs in different states. I'll just put this up here in terms of what this talk was based on and some of the published works. There's other things coming down the pike. And I just want to say thank you very much. Appreciate being here. So, thank you. So I think we have plenty of time for questions. Oh, right there. Sorry.
So my name is Christian. Thank you, Dr. Berends, for coming to talk to us today. So I'll start by saying, microphone. I'll start by saying, so I'm already kind of familiar with your research on ability grouping and tracking.
Oh, really? Wow.
That's my area of research.
We go way back.
Yes. And so as I was going, I underlined and had like little question marks because they're related questions. It's kind of two parts. So I noticed that you said that as you were interviewing the teachers, a lot of them had assumptions based on the students being Black and brown, that they were involved in the voucher programs. And you also mentioned that one of the ways they wanted to address challenges was with boot camps and lower level courses. Even though I know you pointed out that you couldn't really disentangle that from the data. And what I'm kind of curious about, and this could be speculation or based on your interviews or your researches, do you believe that these kind of assumptions about like Black and brown students being on the voucher program, whether they were or not, right?
Yeah.
And this idea of creating these boot camps and these lower level courses kind of created, I don't know if you had like the class level data specifically to look at it to see if there were changes in kind of compositions where there were some classes that may or may not have been more Black and brown or voucher students than others, and if there were kind of differences based on that.
Yeah, what's your name?
Christian.
Christian, thank you for your question. Yeah, I mean, so this, when I heard this from the interviews, I kind of cringed a little bit, knowing what I know about ability grouping and tracking. And now we know how to use it effectively, whether it's heterogeneous grouping or ability. I mean, there's ways we can pivot to make sure that everybody has opportunities. Unlike back when I was doing this research, the gap just increased in achievement between kids in the low groups and kids in the high groups. So that is concerning. And again, we don't know how they did that. We don't know how it was implemented. And maybe it was good, maybe it was not. It's a huge question, because particularly early on, if schools are taking in students who are black and brown and they're making remedial courses, guess where these kids end up? And they could be stuck there. And we know that about ability grouping, and that's a problem. Now, that means, and so the question is, I don't know. But I have a colleague at Notre Dame who's going through the Indiana data, and we have coursework in there. And he's kind of he's dealing at the high school level in terms of kind of coursework in that. And as that develops, we could look at these kids on vouchers. And if we can go back far enough, we can kind of get at your question of the composition of kids in the lower groups and even the relationship to student achievement. I mean, it's not causal, but we could do some of those analyses to see if that holds up. So thank you. I want to write that down, because you just gave an opportunity to collaborate with a colleague and a new research idea. So thank you. Okay, sir.
Yeah, my name is Rafael Lara. I'm the chair for the bilingual ESL and dual language programs. As you may know, in Texas, most of our school districts are rural.
Yeah.
You mentioned equity, diversity, inclusion. So that is that. So far today, we are not allowed to express.
Yeah, I know. I'm speaking out of turn, and call me guilty. I'm leaving tomorrow. During the night. Okay, sorry.
How can we respond to our schools who are located in remote areas around Texas? Texas, as you know, is the largest state in our nation.
Yeah.
How can we provide services that all the students have the great opportunity to succeed?
Yeah, I mean, we're all dealing with that question, right? I'll just throw out kind of where I'm at. And again, this changes over time because recent events have been very recent. So I come from Notre Dame. Catholic institution, takes its Catholic mission really seriously. I happen to see the world through a Christian and Catholic lens. And my response to kind of this executive order to make this a colorblind society, my response to that is, you can say that, but I have two things to say. One is, the demographics of this country are changing, and they're going to change. This is a huge wave that is not going to be changed by executive order. We are becoming much more black, brown, pick your color other than white in this country than we've ever been before. I see that continuing. So we have to deal with that. We have to deal with that in our cities, in rural areas. So that's one response. That is not going to stop, and we can ignore it, but we have to deal with that. The second thing is kind of more of a personal approach to this, is that I talk to my students who are in turmoil about, like graduate students are in turmoil about their jobs, that were in research firms that used to exist. And hopefully that'll come back, but also undergrads, about how to kind of deal with this kind of restriction in language, if you will. And I say, look, the way I respond to people is, I come from a tradition of, and it's not just Catholic and Protestant or Christian. I mean, there's other religions that definitely have this, but I kind of center on that so many religions, like Catholicism, Catholic social teaching, talk about the dignity of every human being, right? And also that there's preferential option for the poor and the vulnerable. And if the current administration wants to stand against the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church worldwide, who believe that in some ways, and I know there's variance in, of this, but that's kind of where I land to say, I'm going to enter down that path, because I think that's most respectful of people, particularly people who are vulnerable, that I feel like we have a moral obligation to. That's my opinion. Plenty of people don't hold that opinion, but I'm going to hold on to that. And I had the opportunity to meet with a dear friend who she's the chancellor of the University of Illinois at Chicago, and my question was kind of, how are you, I mean, that wasn't with rural, but just kind of generally, how are we dealing with this? And she goes, yeah, and University of Illinois is like 60%, Black and brown students, a ton of Pell Grant and first generation. I mean, it's a very diverse school. She came from Notre Dame, so this is like sea change. But she said, we can get paralyzed in this, but we really need to kind of press into what we know best. She said, so I'm a higher ed administrator, and you're a faculty member or whatever. You can press into what you know in higher education. And Notre Dame is kind of under attack. I think Texas A&M is flying under the radar screen. Good for you. But we're all kind of concerned about this. So press into higher education. And I'm also a sociologist, which hopefully I'll have a job in 10 years, given the climate, right? And so pressing into that, because I think some of this information that presented today is really important for all students. And part of this is DEI, and I don't know what that all means for politicians, but I think that's where I come in to enter in. And so it's a work in progress. Like all of our relationships with other people and other groups is always a work in progress. So thank you for your question. You and then you sorry. Sorry to point, but you're right behind each other. Yeah.
And I'm just wondering about the slide where you have the reading scores,
Yeah.
the bands, and
Yeah.
also the band. So if those were matched in the beginning,
Yeah.
so they were all
Yeah.
equivalent. And so in the beginning, so I'm wondering about the types of students. For example, did you look at that by ethnic group,
Yeah.
by program areas, for example, ESL,
Yeah.
bilingual?
We looked at it by ELL and special. That's the data we had. So we didn't break it down any further. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So you did look at that?
Yeah, and these effects that we show, and again, this is earlier on in the program, which has changed a lot. We didn't really find differences, but this is pretty consistent across different groupings of students, by and large. So yeah.
Yes.
And that's the same in English language arts as it was in mathematics.
Yes. And I have one other question about the push out
Yeah,
programs. So that means that schools, like I'm a principal, and so I can decide, okay, Mark is going to the voucher program. Is that, am I?
no, so it would be my,
Tell me about that.
yeah, so it'd be my family's decision to say we're gonna transfer Mark from a public school to a private school. And then the question is like, well, is Mark and all the kids like him that are making this move all high achievers? Or less costly to educate or less disruptive. And so, we're looking at that kind of characteristics of the group that move, and we didn't find any cream skimming. But on the push out, we did find that the lowest achieving students were kind of being counseled out in some way, or some of the special ed kids were, and doing some of and again, this is just a few interviews, but you could hear like parents and some of the principals, like we had to make adjustments. And those adjustments were kind of talking with the families to kind of counsel them out so that they were no longer in the school. So, I mean, it's basically, in higher ed, we would say politely fired.
Gary Frankel, great presentation.
Thanks, Gary.
You talked a lot about how one of the primary motivating factors behind a lot of private schools, particularly religious Catholic schools participating in the voucher program, was the mission-driven sort of approach.
Yeah.
In your research, did you find that the parents that were choosing those schools had that same kind of mission-driven mentality for their children, or was there any evidence or indication of misalignment between the parents and some of the schools they were choosing?
I appreciate that question. Yeah, there was some misalignment. And I think schools did all they could with some success and some failure in making that happen. In the interviews of parents who picked up a voucher, They didn't talk about it necessarily in religious terms. Sometimes they did. Like, this is just an environment where I want my kid to have some sort of religious education. And families make that decision all the time. And she was able to do that. Again, this is a limited number of interviews, but one of the messages that came through time and time again, which were very moving interviews of these, parents of kids that were receiving vouchers, was, this saved my kid. I mean, the perception was, this saved my kid. They were lost in the previous public school, and now I feel like they have a place here. Is that really reality, or is it just perception? I don't know. But I mean, there was a lot of that sentiment being expressed of that they were really thankful for this opportunity. Now, Catholic schools, on average are higher performing, but it's always a problem as well. It's because wealthier families go to private schools because they afford it. I mean, there's all those selection effects going on. And so that's an issue, but they appreciated the perception, at least, that their kids would be better cared for in a Catholic setting than their previous public school. It would be nice to have a longitudinal survey of kids over time about their experiences rather than, Mark Berends and his team filter of the interviews. So thank you.
Hey Mark, thanks for joining us. In the South Bend community, there's been the fifth largest city in the state of Indiana.
Oh, very good.
100,000 people.
Yeah.
For a property owner there, but so there's been multiple closings of public schools, including a very high-profile, once thriving high school, Clay High School, that had closed its doors since the voucher program started. And I didn't hear a lot today about money, and it seems to me, I'm not an educational researcher, but it seems to me that school choice obviously causes a huge influx of money to move from, in this example, the South Bend Community School Corporation into private schools. And anecdotally, the private schools in South Bend, St. Joe and Trinity and Marion and Mishawaka, seem to be doing very well and have brand new...
Are you my neighbor or what?
But they seem to be doing very well.
Yeah, for sure.
With cash. And so do you have any data on the outflows of money from public schools to private schools as a result of programs like these? And secondly, actually leading to the closure of public schools in communities in Indiana?
Yeah, that's a really good question. South Bend is about 100,000 people. It's got a private public sector. It's got some charter schools that have emerged. It's small, but it's urban in its makeup and in its problems. And you're right, there's a real concern among the public school educators I talk to of like, these vouchers in charter schools are just siphoning money that we really need. And there's some of that, but I remind people of another thing that's happening in Indiana and elsewhere, and that just demographically, school-age children in K-12 is shrinking. I'm on tail end of the baby boom, which was, huge in terms of the students in K-12 education. So that's another part, just demographically, to keep in mind. I'm not an ed finance person, but this is a cause for concern. I mean, part of me is, my perspective is I've made personal choices for my kids, sending them all kinds of different schools, including homeschooling for a time. But when I come into looking at charter schools or voucher, I really try to be agnostic and be as objective as possible. And just pointing out, if you're for this, you need to think about these things. If you're against it, you may want to think about these things. That being said, there's some of the private schools in South Bend are fabulous. Some of the charter schools are really innovative. I think they're relatively new to kind of figure out what the results are. So we have a charter school network in South Bend where there's a big billionaire behind all of this, and he was in manufacturing, making something of something. He made a lot of money off, but he's totally connected to all the manufacturing in the state. So his idea was, let's really up our game in career technical education. And we're gonna have kids that, these kids in one charter school win robotics fairs across the world. I mean, they're all in on that. And there's another charter high school that is kind of along the similar lines of career technical education, and it's all kind of competency-based. They don't have grades, they don't give percentages. And it's very innovative like that. My question for those schools are, if you're not in the career technical part, what are your opportunities for college, attendance and things like that? The private schools in the voucher program do really well at that. I mean, it's sort of college expectations for all. I mean, my son and daughter went to Marian Catholic High School, and it was just really oriented. And my son was there during the big shock of the voucher system. And, different schools reacted differently at the beginning of the voucher program, where like Marian High School, for example, took a few kids in at a time. Whereas some schools like doubled their enrollment because they were about to close. I mean, there is that issue. And so there was kind of variation in the number of students. And I think the way it happened with Marian, and then when the pathways opened up, it was a smoother, somewhat transition for some of these kids on vouchers. And so it is an issue. It is an issue not only in South Bend, Indiana, the state as a whole, and it's going to be a issue in Texas too, I think, given the nature of the bill. Hopefully I answered your question.
So you don't have any data that like the money funneled via the school voucher program away from public education costs?
No, I don't. So,
high school to close?
yeah, so Ed Choice is a advocacy group that does a lot of research. And I'm not a proponent of, I point everybody towards them because they are really good at describing different choice policies across the states. And they have a researcher that has done an analysis of cost savings. And, when the voucher is like $6,000 and maybe the tuition is $10,000, on average for the state, that's saving money in a way. It has an analysis that does that. But a lot of that depends, getting kind of it's not my area, but some of the technical details are, it really depends on the kids that switch from a public to a private school to kind of get those savings. Where now only a third of the students in Indiana have previously attended public schools, that kind of cost analysis that he did previously needs to be redone. And hopefully he'll do that, because they say it's a savings. Again, it's Ed Choice, so one can take that as a grain of salt as an advocacy for school choice. They publish a lot of research on their website. I don't think my study with Joe Waddington is on there with the negative effects. That's fine, but it kind of just raises an eyebrow about, they're really good about putting descriptive information, a lot of research out there, but they are an advocacy group and have that kind of backdrop of that. So hopefully we'll be able to do that more, because now it's, we're spending millions and millions of dollars on this program, and it's now with the latest 2024 eligibility increase in income, it's worth looking at.
Hi, thanks so much for sharing your work today. I'm Ji Han. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Public Service and Administration. So I guess my question is related to the previous question. So you found that the effects of math scores were not really different depending on student characteristics. Right?
In English language arts. Yeah, so when we had a matched group of students, some of that made the switch to a private school, some of them stayed in public schools. Over time, there was no difference in their achievement between, say, the treatment group and control group.
Yeah, and your survey...
In English language arts.
Okay, so in your survey results, it seemed to suggest that the drop in math scores could be due to students not really adapting to new expectations that they didn't really have before. So were you able to see if those effects were coming from students who switched from traditional public schools versus like those who always stayed in private schools? Because you said that there were a lot of vouchers.
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of generates hypotheses. That's the best I can say in terms of, these are interviews, so it's based on, principals and teachers and parents and kids kind of giving their responses to the question prompts. And so some of those kids were the ones that made the switch. Some of those answers were based on people that perceived the switch, that had been in the school for a while. So that's where it's coming from in terms of preparation of the kids and some of the challenges of social and academic integration. We don't have data that we can incorporate into the test score records of kids to really tease whether there are moderating or mediating effects of that. Unfortunately, it would be great.
So you don't have data on whether they switched from traditional public schools or not?
Well, in the quantitative data, we're looking at switchers. That's what that all is based on. We're looking at students in math who are matched up with their public schools.
You don't have students who receive vouchers, but like stayed in private school.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't present that. So we did another paper after these pathways opened up where we were still able to look at kids who switched from a public to a private school on a voucher. But some other kids had been in a private school all along, and all of a sudden became eligible to receive a voucher. No impact on their achievement. They just kind of continued as they were, which you might expect. I mean, it's just, students in schools don't know where their tuition sometimes is coming from. And so if you've been in a private school for a while and all of a sudden started getting a voucher, your achievement didn't change.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay.
I wasn't sure like
Okay.
where the effects are coming from. A related question, so those students who were pushed out, were they also included in your quantitative data showing how the math?
Yeah, we did an approach where some of them were included that if they had it at all, then they were, included. Believe me, in these papers, we did a ton of robustness checks and we excluded them, we included them, we did this all kinds of ways that I can't remember off the top of my head, but there must have been a dozen robustness checks and surprisingly, they all didn't change the results. Because on average, some of them might. Yeah.
That might be like a direct way to kind of test, like, is it like students who were not able to adapt to the new expectations, are they being pushed out or not? We don't know for sure, but we were able to track kids, kind of back to the paper I didn't talk about today, like track kids that, some parents did some weird things in the beginning. So you had to be in a public school, right, early on. You had parents that had their kids in private school, took their kids out and put them in public school so that they could be eligible for a voucher. Their decision, go do you. But then those kids would qualify, so they transferred back to a public school, then they transferred into a private school with the voucher, and maybe some of those kids ended up transferring back to a public school because for whatever reason, it wasn't a good fit for them. Those results are negative. I mean, the more kids are moving, and we just know that about student mobility anyway, forget about any sort of school choice program. The more kids move, it's just really difficult. And so those kids were really at a disadvantage. But we don't have all the kinds of additional information we have on student experiences and family experience that we would love to have. And that's why we're just trying to piece together these sources of data to kind of shed light on it. Some of the quantitative analysis we feel more confident about, and the qualitative data are suggestive and informative, as well as some of the other data we gathered. So that's kind of the best we can do without large-scale, data collection across it.
So I'm just wondering.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
Carl Fehrenwald, I teach in educational administration master's program. I'm just wondering if you could address a different aspect of equity in that right now, if you don't have a voucher program, the status quo is there is still school choice if you're socioeconomically able to exercise it.
Yeah.
And, obviously but you've went through all the pros and the cons of, there's no panacea, one school or another, private or public, but you went through the different advantages, disadvantages. And so to me, equity would mean that every family has the ability to sort that out regardless of what subpopulation they're among. And, it might be that their math scores never do catch up, but then you didn't address that if they stay in the public schools, they're not going to be at grade level either in math or English.
Right.
And so their English scores are about the same. They're more likely to go to college. They're perhaps less different social groups. Maybe they're less likely to get in trouble, that kind of thing. So I guess equity from that standpoint, and that goes back to the, like that negative connotation of push out.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't understand why you would use that
Well, I mean, this has been a big thing in the literature, and I would like to change that word, but
Yeah.
to enter into the research literature, these are the terms that are used. Just like terms for different racial ethnic categories have changed over time, and some may be more appropriate right now than others. I mean, that's sort of what we're dealing with. That's why I wanted to point out about push out isn't just always a negative thing. It can be a positive thing if we base it on the interviews that we did. And you're right about the equity issues. You know, part of this is I kind of, for better or worse, I think school choice is here to stay. Whether it's voucher or ESA programs or charter schools. And I just, as a researcher, I like to enter into that to say, okay, if we have school choice, what are ways that we can use it effectively or ineffectively? Not forgetting about, you know, 85, 90% of kids that go to traditional public schools in this nation, and thinking about the equity issues there. And kind of back to your point about, you know, equity in terms of school choice, about where I choose to live. I'm in the Clay District, actually. My kids, you know, I made the choice because I had the means to send my kids to Marian Catholic School. And we wanted to do that because we wanted a religious education for our kids. That's not necessarily in these data, you know, about why parents are choosing and the implications of that for their kids and things that we can't measure right now based on the experiences those kids have. But, you know, these are pretty important indicators, I think, that we covered, and this is sort of the information. And it's more nuanced, right? In terms of achievement impacts, it's negative and, you know, neutral. If one's fortunate enough to make it through high school, it's a positive benefit. So it's more nuanced than the current policy debates often are. So I try to enter into the middle of that to point out the nuance. Reporters aren't knocking down my door to kind of interview me about this stuff. I mean, you know, just because, you know, the press, and this is just the way the press is. Whatever side of the press, they don't like nuance. They want strong answers and strong arguments so that people can make decisions. I respect that, but you know, it's more complicated. This is all way more complicated than sometimes we think, and certainly more complicated than policymakers think. And so it's just reminding people of this, and let's try to be thoughtful. And maybe that's naive, but you know, that's my position, and I'm sticking to it. Andy, you got a question?
No, please. This is the dean's distinguished lecturer. I get to control the clock.
And we appreciate you.
we want dialogue. This is great. This is what we're here for.
So my question was just to learn more about the interview data, how maybe there are differences from 2012 to 2018, how were there differences by subgroups or by the context or all those different sources?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So like I said, we did a bunch of these interviews in 2012, very early on in the program. 2018 had been around for a while. It was striking, you know, early on, integration, whether it's, you know, social, academic, or religious, was kind of, those were hot issues for these schools and for these families. You know, 2018, it just kind of smoothed out, where people didn't really think about the voucher program or who the kids were on the vouchers. Now, that being said, despite the smoothing out, there were some issues that kind of changed. One of the issues is that some of the schools took in significant amounts of kids on vouchers. And they made this adjustment where there was some parent interviews of parents that had been in the school for a long time and sent their kids to this school because it had a certain reputation academically. And it was difficult to do these interviews, but these, you know, people would rail against, you know, those voucher kids, and they changed this school, and, you know, they changed the school, and I'm not gonna, you know, I'm not sure I want to send my kids here anymore. So that was part of the change of some really strong reactions about a school becoming more diverse, if you will, both socioeconomically and racially, ethnically. On the other hand, you know, schools really appreciated this voucher program, and as it expanded, more of the families that were already in the school could take advantage of it. For better or worse, we can have that debate. But from school administrator and teachers, I mean, all of a sudden, we're making it more affordable for families to be able to attend, and that helps with the school community and consistency of the community. So kind of those are some of the two big issues that kind of come to mind. So, but thanks for that. Oh, one other thing. I had a graduate student, she now is working at Notre Dame, Julie Dalavis, who really looked at these changes in terms of, she was really interested in school mission, and private schools and Catholic schools really take their mission seriously. And what she found in her results, kind of going through all these mission statements and categorizing these in different ways, with increase in diversity, Catholic schools doubled down on their mission in terms of, really kind of what I was saying before, dignity of every human being, preferential option for the poor. And that there can be two sides of that, like I just described, but I mean, that was something that was pretty striking too, in terms of as new students come in, they kind of need to rethink business as usual, and it seems like they did that, again, based on these same 10 schools at 2 points in time. So thanks for the question.
I'm not sure if your data looked at it, but I was curious to see or to hear if, for the teachers you interviewed, what their qualifications or certifications were, and if those were in parity with public school teachers typically in your state.
Oh, that's a really good question. So the way we went about the interview samples, we kind of tried to stratify it kind of by grade level. We didn't really think about it in terms of experience. We were really, and what we could be criticized for this, we were really reliant on the principals to kind of get teachers to us. And we emphasized, don't cream skim and cherry pick, and I don't think we did. We got, my perception is that we got a pretty good mix of teachers. And I think we got a pretty good mix of teachers by experience. I mean, we kind of aimed for more experienced teachers that had been in the school for a while so that they could talk about the changes rather than a first-year teacher that really can't talk about the past. And so that's kind of how we approached the interview sample. And again, this is a total sample of like 100 people. So we tried to stratify it to get diversity across, the private schools that we had in terms of diversity and different characteristics, and certainly diversity by grade level. But, you can scrub through that and see how well we did, but that's kind of was our approach there. And we felt like we got a pretty good distribution of responses, and that was our hope about different experiences early on, and then later on in the voucher program.
Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned, I didn't think I needed that, but okay. You mentioned that there was some resistance to the vouchers because of the perception of some sort of unfunded mandate from the states referring to curriculum or state control. Has there been any evidence of that in Indiana so far, like that you've seen?
Those results are from India.
That is, that's, but
Yeah,
is
so a little
but
background.
have there been anything to support their, have there been any issues or anything like that going forward?
Well, so, I appreciate the question. So we developed this survey because I had a colleague that was doing this survey in other states and had done this, and we thought, okay, let's replicate this in Indiana. And I had a great graduate student that kind of took this and ran with it. And so this was all private schools we could get in Indiana. With their responses. We didn't do comparisons across other states. I didn't, I think that's out there. But in terms of what we find is that I just know anecdotally some schools that were resistant to taking in kids on scholarship because of the regulations, because of the lowering of academic standards, and probably some other unflattering kinds of reasons. But as the eligibility and requirements increased, they could, be part of the voucher program and just have the families that are in their school take advantage of it. So that's the kind of thing that went on. But we don't.
There hasn't been any mandated curriculums coming from the state?
There hasn't been any mandated curriculum. The experience I've had with, this was early on, back when Common Core was a thing, remember that? Early on in the program, I was struck being in Catholic schools, like for these interviews, that they were all on board, like with the Common Core in Indiana at the time was, and that got into a brouhaha, and they kind of renamed the standards, but they were Common Core-like in a way. But all that is to say the Catholic schools pay attention to what other public schools and what the state is doing. And the state doesn't drive what kids should teach in the classroom in private schools, but private schools are on board because they want the best, they want to help their kids, and some of the state stuff is pretty good. Some of it's not, but some, so that, hopefully that answers your question. Good, I get to be over here now.
I'm Brian Holtzman, I'm an assistant professor in the Education and Policy program. So you found negative effects on math and seniors about 0.15 standard deviations.
Yeah.
And then you found positive associations on educational attainment.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's not causal, so, or at least,
Yeah.
causal at this point. So I was just wondering if you think that, I'm just curious about that discrepancy. Do you think that is because of causality issues, or do you think it reflects some of the stuff that we found in the school study around?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's kind of a paradox in the school choice literature, particularly on vouchers, where some of these statewide voucher programs, I mean, some voucher programs, just generally going way back, some of these voucher programs have negative effects, but then positive effects on student educational attainment. We kind of fall in that mix. And that's a mixed bag because not all of these kids who are on a scholarship make it all 4 years through high school. Doesn't necessarily have negative effects if they return to a public school at that point. In fact, they may be less likely to drop out. Yeah, so it's, part of it's just this paradox that we kind of need to untangle more. And we can all sit here for hours to think of hypotheses about that, but that's a question for further research to kind of try to untangle some of that.
I can't remember, were you just looking at college enrollments or college completion?
No, oh, great question. So this is just college enrollment in 2- and 4-year colleges. That's what those results are based on. Our next steps are that we want to merge the data we have from the Indiana Department of Education to, there's an Indiana Commission on Higher Education, as well as the National Clearinghouse. Both of those we'd be able to kind of know where they go in the nation and whether they have persistence and have, end up with a degree. That's just been really difficult to get, just bureaucratically to get access to those data in a way. So, I won't go into that, but it's been difficult because they have a new agency that's supposed to help merging data across different agencies like higher ed and K-12 or workforce, and that agency is serving a lot of people in government. So it's aimed for researchers, but researchers' requests kind of fall at the bottom. We're making progress in this paper that, I said preliminary results on educational attainment. Our hope is to broaden the set of outcomes we have with the Indiana Commission on Higher Ed, which has things like remediation, as well as the clearinghouse data to kind of figure out graduation rather than just enrollment. So thanks for that question. That's, in 5 years, maybe you'll have me back and I'll actually have that paper done. It's just been a really long, we were really close, but then the pandemic hit and they changed the whole structure of access to data, which is fine, but it's just really slowed things down. So thanks for that.
Yeah, Nathan Hawk. So several years ago, I was doing a very deep dive into the charter school landscape, particularly in Ohio, for some of my dissertation research. In particular, looking at some of the data that came out of Stanford University's CREDO center out there. That looked a lot of the similar types of descriptive analyses that you looked at in terms of matched public schools and whatnot. And one thing I kind of a point of just emphasis, I guess, is they found a lot of similar characteristics in terms of mathematics, lack of achievement, also reading as well. And I found that of kind of some interest there, but obviously not on the kind of the school voucher end. But I kind of set that up to kind of ask you to kind of go back earlier in the presentation. You talked about some of the distinctions between, say, Indiana and some of the other states that have some of these different programs and how there are definitely some different nuances there. So first clarification, whether I heard that correct, that you kind of said there are a lot of different nuances and you could even kind of get back to that type of topic, but also further elaborate on where and how you think there may be some differences between some of these different state initiatives and why you might see some of these findings that you found in
Like
Indiana
different
versus otherwise.
state choice
Yeah,
options, like charter schools?
just in general,
or-
with that, and I know you said you haven't, you know, a lot of the work has not been within charter schools, it's been more with these school vouchers, but talk a bit more into that in terms of some of these state differences, if you have some of that data or have done some of that research into that.
Yeah, so, I mean, we've done a lot of charter school research in Indiana as well. I mean, just from what we know about vouchers, of just kind of looking at achievement impacts, a lot of the earlier studies that were done in places like Milwaukee or New York or, you know, Dayton, you know, they would find some positive impacts for kids some of the time and for certain groups of kids. It just wasn't hugely robust across these different sites. And it probably is based on the city and the type of policy they had there, and, you know, and that could be disentangled. The recent statewide voucher programs, and we can throw DC, I mean, DC had positive effects early on and now it's, you know, had negative effects. But like Louisiana, Ohio, Indiana, these statewide voucher programs have had negative effects on student achievement. On the charter school landscape, people have done meta-analyses. I think of Julian Betts at the University of California, San Diego, kind of updates his charter school meta-analyses. And then the Credo at Stanford does a bunch of these studies. I mean, it's kind of shifted over time, but currently it's like some positive effects for kids. Particularly the Knowledge is Power program, the KIPP program. I mean, that, you know, kind of joke that's like Catholic schools in the public sector, you know, in terms of stereotypical, just real disciplined and, you know, real focused on achievement. And there's been studies that have looked at the, you know, downside of that. But KIPP schools, for example, have real positive effects on students. It's not for every family, but, you know, for those kids, if you're caring about achievement, they have positive effects. So, you know, and Patrick Wolf has done some meta-analyses of the voucher programs and found slightly positive effects. I question some of the, you know, meta-analysis depends on the studies you include. You know, so you can kind of, we can have academic arguments about his inclusion, but I think the positive findings across the board on charter schools are a bit more positive. But I was just part of a panel that was like, what's the future of charter schools given the current administration? And you know, some of the people in the know think they're gonna be here. I mean, you know, some states have so many of them, but that, you know, some, you know, the initial idea of charter schools is let's free them up from some regulations and let them be innovative. And that's been a mixed bag, but some are, you know, I've been in some charter schools that are really, really innovative, you know, but it's a matter of how to scale that up. So, you know, sort of a wishy-washy answer to your question. I mean, charter schools are tending towards the positive. Voucher programs, we got to kind of wait and see. Well, I don't know if we'll ever know about this expansion of education savings accounts, just because we're not gathering, from what I know, we're not gathering any data. The Senate and House bills in Texas, I don't think there's any data. You know, I mean, you can take your ITBS test, but they're not taking a state test. And so it's just problematic. But thanks for the question. Sure.
Just as a note, we also have in public schools here now in Texas, we have what's called districts of innovation.
Okay.
And so a public school district can do lots of things, you know, alternative types of.
Yeah, what is that? So we have that in Indianapolis, but I'm curious, that can mean a lot of different things. So I'm just kind of curious about what that might mean here.
They could take we're in the educating world in terms of principals and superintendents, but they could take a person who is not yet certified, and you know, they can do certification issue, placements, and it's just, I mean, they can change the curriculum, they can a lot of anything that's what they want to call innovative, they can do. And, you know, they can rule the law, I guess.
Are they held accountable in any way?
Yes.
Okay, like they take the state test or, and people monitor that?
Yes. Yes, they
Yeah. Yeah, so that, I mean, Indianapolis Public Schools, it sounds like somewhat similar where they've done some of these innovation schools. They're almost like charters, but they're totally public schools. I mean, charters are public schools, but, you know, they're part of this Indianapolis Public School District. And Had some success with that, but that's just all being called. It's not going to be heard, but there's a bill that's kind of in the background of turning Indiana. It's almost like New Orleans. They're going to turn it all into charter schools, and there won't be any traditional public schools. That's not going to happen this year. Could very well happen next year. And so, you can call them innovate, and they've had some innovation schools, but it's part of this is, okay, Indianapolis public schools, at least, those innovation schools seem not to have improved enough that, at least by the state legislature's perspective, we're just going to turn it all into charters, because that perhaps will solve the situation. It's an open question, and so I don't, Yeah, exactly, yeah. Good comparative study, perhaps, yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you, appreciate it, yeah.
Let's give another round of applause to Dr. Berends, please. I want to thank you, Mark, for getting a little bit of a taste of our Texas A&M University culture. Thank you for sharing your research insights with us today. Your work provides critical perspectives on the evolution of school choice policies and their impact on students, schools, and communities. I also want to thank each of you for attending today's lecture. Your engagement in these discussions helps further our mission of advancing education and human development. To give you a picture of the impact, Mark, there are at least 3 to 4 research center directors here today who operate very, very large research enterprises, so you drew much interest. We have our aspiring and our rising stars, our assistant professors, associate professors, newly promoted professors, students, all in attendance today. So I want to thank you. I also want to take this opportunity to highlight something to our community that is extremely important. There are many topics on the educational landscape and the policy landscape that are at critical junctures today, not only in the climate in which we are living, but the work that we need to accomplish. We will not take a step back. We will not shy away from the difficult topics that we must address. But I also must add that today, more than ever, your dedication for being here and being present exemplifies what it is going to require for us to remain united and face these challenges. We cannot stay back. We cannot stay home. COVID-19 is over, okay? And we must, ladies and gentlemen, it is critical that we must be present. We must show a unified force, because the winds will be getting stronger before they subside. And as your leader, I will meet those headwinds head on. But I need you. I need your help from every school, from every college, from the Bush School of Public Policy to all other colleges, departments, centers across this university. We must stand. And the challenges are many, from academic freedom to standing up for those who need a voice. We must all work together. It is our mission. And Dr. Berends brought one segment of the conversation to light today. I want to thank you, Mark, for that. I also want to welcome those of you who did stand up and did attend today. Right outside the theater, we have a nice little reception where we can continue the conversation. I didn't want to prolong this, but the dean had many questions as well. But I'll hold them, and I have the privilege of sharing dinner with Mark tonight, so we'll do that tonight. Mark, enjoy Texas A&M University today. And thanks everyone for a wonderful, wonderful dialogue and discussion. Good afternoon, everyone.